Tan Zhonghui, the challenger for the world crown, starts with the English opening c4. Current world champion Zhu Wenjun responds with knight f6, and this is game 2 of the Women World Championship match in Shanghai. White continues with knight c3, e5, knight f3, knight c6, g3. Normally white play here e3 or e4, but g3 obviously also a theoretical move to develop the bishop on g2. Zhu Wenjun strikes in the middle with d5, exchange of the pawns on d5, bishop goes to a long diagonal on g2, bishop c5 for Zhu Wenjun. This move became popular in the last 10 years. Castle for white, castle for black, d3, opening the diagonal for the black square bishop, h6, opening the luft for the king and also not allowing white pieces to get to a square g5. Exchange of the knights on d5, bishop goes to d2 with the idea to develop it on c3, where it would pressure the pawn on e5. Queen goes back to d6, just to avoid some unpleasant discovery attacks by the bishop that is staring at that queen from the square g2. So queen d6, bishop c3, with some pressure on the pawn on e5. Queen goes back to e7, knight d2. Knight has more squares to go from d2 than it had from f3. Squares c4 and e4 look pretty juicy in this position. Zhu plays the knight in the center of the board on d4. White doesn't want to keep it there and immediately ask the knight to go away with the move e3. But after knight b5, black would have an advantage of two bishops, because white cannot protect the bishop on c3 from being exchanged. So this is a little victory in the opening for black. a4, exchange of the minor pieces on c3, and we have a position where white has very nice pawn center, but black has an advantage of two bishops, which is always good in open positions. c6. c6 is an important move to shorten the diagonal for the light square bishop for white, and now black can develop their light square bishop, because if they played bishop d7 or bishop e6 here, the pawn on b7 would be hanging. So c6, a5, bishop goes to d7, and queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Zhu defends the pawn with rook b8, not only defends that pawn, but also trying to open b file with the move b6. Knight finally goes to a very nice square on e4, and now black loses its advantage of two bishops, because bishop on c5 is going to be exchanged, bishop d6, exchange of the minor pieces again, d4. Strike in the middle, and black plays b6. They go with their own plan to open the file b and start some activity on the queen side of the board. Exchange of the pawns on the b6 square. Rook takes b6 is not a very good move, because the pawn on a7 will be isolated and weak. Therefore a takes b6. White penetrate into black position with the rook a7. Bishop e6 challenging the queen. Queen a4, attacking the pawn on c6 with two pieces. Rook c8 defending that pawn, and rook b1. We have a position that looks like white achieved a lot. They have all their pieces in very active positions. They're challenging black pawns, and black seem to be defending. But this position is really even, because despite visual advantage, white do not have anything concrete here to gain advantage, especially after the move bishop d5. Now the bishops would be exchanged, first the pawns, now queen d4, which is very nice move, because now black must exchange the queens. If they don't do that, they will lose the pawn on b6. And after queen takes d4, the pawn on c3 and e3, the pawns that were not connected now become connected, which is always a good thing. So now pawns c and d are both supporting each other. Exchange of the bishops on g2. We have a rook endgame, which is a theoretical draw if both players are playing perfect chess. But again, this is World Championship, and despite the fact that both players are very, very strong grandmasters, mistakes could happen. So let's see what happened. b5, rook e1, rook a8, penetrating with another rook on e7, challenging the pawn on f7. Obviously, black has to eliminate one of the rooks, exchange of the rooks on a7. We have c5, king f3, exchange of the pawns again. 4 pawns against 4 pawns, rook against rook. The game is going to be a draw. It's pretty clear at this point. But let's see. King f8. You always want to put your rook behind the opposing passing pawn, and that's exactly what Tan Zhongyi does with rook b7, attacking the pawn on b4. Rook c3 check, king e4, and rook c2 attacking the pawn on f2. It's always good to counterattack. It's always good to have your rook active in rook endgame, and that's exactly what black do here. King e3 protecting the pawn on f2, another check, king d2, rook f3. King e2, again asking the rook where it will go. It has to protect the pawn on b5. It can go either to f5 or to b3. One of those moves is correct, the other one is not exactly good. And the world champion chooses the wrong square. She put her rook on square f5. The reason the square is not so good, because in this position the rook is very passive. It's glued to protecting the pawn on b5, and it doesn't have many ways to get active and to get into the game. Rook b3 would have been a much better choice. White continues with king e3. You want to activate your king in the endgames, in pawn endgames, in rook endgames, pretty much in any endgame. You want your king in the center of the board, so king e3, h5, f4, gaining some space, and here comes the first real blunder of the match. I'm saying the match because yesterday's game, game 1, that ended in a draw, both players played at 99% accuracy. So they both played like computers yesterday. Today, they played like computers pretty much till now for 40 moves, and this was the first real blunder. Of course, you might ask why this is a blunder. I'm not losing the rook, I'm not losing anything. The reason it's a blunder because the next move is king e4. And it turns out that the rook, you remember we discussed that the rook is very passive here, the rook doesn't have many moves. It's under attack, and it also has to protect the pawn on b5, and it cannot do both. The move g6 doesn't really work, because after d5, the pawn on b5 would be captured anyway. So therefore, Zhu Wenjun has no choice and plays a rook f6 and surrenders the pawn on b5. Tan Zhongyi takes the pawn, attacks the pawn on h5, g6 protecting that pawn on h5, and d5. Computer considered this a mistake, but it's not really a big mistake. White still has all the advantage they need. Rook a6. Finally, black activate the rook, but it's a little too late. King e5. The king is marching towards black territory. f6 check, king d4, rook a2. Here is another instructive point. The pawn on h2 is not that important. What's more important is activity of the king and the rook. King c5. Sacrificing the pawn on h2. Check on b8, king d7, another check, king c8, and now the rook, the white rook, goes to the other side of the board to pick up the pawns on the king side of the board for black. The pawn on g6 cannot be really protected. g5, now another important point. You cannot take the pawn on g5, believe it or not. If you take the pawn on g5, f takes g5, rook takes g5, after h4, and this exchange, this is a theoretical draw position. This is called a Philidor position, which is known to all chess players at certain level. And again, black in this position have a way to draw this, and obviously both players know this. Therefore, after g5, Tan Zhonghui plays f5, which is the best move and pretty much the only move to keep the advantage. h4, exchange of the pawns on h4. Again, you want to put your rook behind the passing pawn of the opponent, rook h7, h3. Now you kind of want to play d6, right? You want to put your, you want to march with your pawn to become a queen as soon as possible. d6 would be a big mistake. d6 would be a draw, because black would start checking the white king from behind, and white king will not be able to escape the checks and win the game. So d6 would be a mistake. Instead, you want to put your king in front of the pawn. King d6, very important move. King b8, king d7, d6, and now the pawn is marching forward, and the king is protected from the checks by this pawn. So rook d2 is not a check, which is very important. King b6, king d8, rook h1, d7. Again, there is no check from d1. h2, rook h3, king b7, another important check from b3. Now the king cannot go to c6 because Tan Zhonghui will play king c8. I'm sorry, king c8 would be a draw. They would have to make another check on c3, king b5, rook c2, king b4, and now king c7, and the pawn will march forward. Complicated stuff, but white makes all the correct moves. So rook b3 check, king e7, and now the king is cut off from the action, which is important. Rook b2, king a6, rook e2, rook e2, and now the white king can escape on the e file. So there would be no checks from the e file. King goes to b7 and king e7, final move of the game. The pawn moves forward, becomes a queen. White would win. Now, if this was not the game of two best players in the world, then of course you would like to continue with rook d1 and kind of make sure that white knows what to do here, because if white goes with the queen, it becomes not so easy. Rook takes d8, and if king takes d8, black wins. So white would have to be careful. After rook takes d8, they would have to take the pawn on h2. This is still winning, but this would require more precise moves. So if rook d1, the best continuation for white is rook b2 check, king a7, rook takes h2, and this position is still very much winning, but the game could still continue. Instead, the world champion resigned in this position because obviously on this level, this is a total win for white. Then John Wee showed absolute masterpiece in the endgame. Zhu Wenjun, the world champion, unfortunately for her, made one big mistake in the whole game, and the game was 62 moves. She made one mistake when she put her king to e8. And that mistake cost her the game, and now Tan Zhonghui, the challenger for the title, is leading the match 1.5 to half point.